Okay, greetings everyone. So this is Sentinel Apologetics, Robert, along with a panel here, Aaron, Hound, Hunter, Tony Lee Wayne, and our special guest, Dr. Hugh Ross. So this is actually the first interview that's happening on this channel with Dr. Hugh Ross, and we've been a huge support and big fan base of Reasons to Believe and everything that Dr. Ross has done. And an introduction to Hugh Ross is this. He's an astronomer and he is the best-selling author in regards to Christianity and cutting-edge scientific discoveries. His organization, Reasons to Believe, is dedicated to demonstrating that science and the Bible are allies, not enemies. And his books include, what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to show it. So why the universe is the way it is. Hidden treasures in the book of Job, Navigating Genesis, the updated addition to A Matter of Days, and my current favorite, Improbable Planet. But Hugh Ross actually has released a 4th edition to The Creator and the Cosmos, but this is the 3rd edition, so unfortunately I didn't get the 4th one. And each of these books have a theme of, let me broadcast to you. There it is.
Yeah. Okay.
So what I've noticed is that each of these books have a let me stop presenting. Each of these books have a theme of basically the Reasons to Believe model, the Reasons to Believe model that continues to expand and update itself, refine itself. It follows after the scientific method, and I think really, I mean, for example, the Creator and the Cosmos, and also Navigating Genesis, but specifically this was written first in 91, and now your 4th edition is 2018. That's like 17 years since the 3rd edition. And I think just to start off this Q&A interview with you, Dr. Ross, 17 years is a long time. And I saw in one of your discussions on the Paradox Sunday class that you've added another, I think it's 70 pages of updated material.
It's 70 pages longer, but it's actually 80 pages of new content because I took out about 12 pages. A lot of the stuff in The Origin of Life I've deleted because we have a whole book on The Origin of Life now. So it gave me room to add more content. So 80 pages of new content.
Right. And, you know, I became a Christian in 2009 at the age of 21. And the book that actually, well, 2 books actually that got me hooked, I guess, on the Genesis account would be this classic, which I'm sure you know that people don't have, I guess, these copies anymore, The Creation and Time that you wrote. And what would have become Navigating Genesis, which is the Genesis question. And yeah, so these two, so I came across your work about 2-3 years after I became a Christian, and then I realized, wow, here's an astronomer, an actual scientist that has a model, a scientific model that engages with the text in a concordant sort of way. And it really appealed to me. And 9 years later, in my Christian walk, I've noticed that Romans 1:20, the characteristics of God and how he operates continues to be unveiled through the book of nature. And when I look at your work, going back from the 90s up until literally today, which would be Creator and Cosmos, the 4th edition, it just seems never ending. It proves the scripture true that as we learn more about the book of nature, it just continues to accommodate with the latest in findings, and it just keeps going on and on and on. And is this something that you yourself started to, I guess, have some form of holy anxiety in the sense like an excitement as you produce these new editions? And I hope you understand where I'm going with that.
I
Yeah.
saw that even when I was not yet a Christian, going through the Bible seriously for the first time, especially in Psalms and Job, that the more you learn about nature, the more evidence you'll see for God's supernatural handiwork. So I've been putting that to the test since age 18. And I most dramatically see that in the 4 editions of the Creator and the Cosmos, how the evidence actually increases exponentially as you look at the universe and physics, that there has to be a God behind it all, who not only personally designed it for life, but personally designed it for human beings, and specifically so that billions of humans could come into a redemptive relationship with the creator of the universe. To me, that's where I've seen the greatest explosion of new evidence, is putting it in the context of what fine tuning do you need for the redemption of human beings to be possible.
And I think your prayer, if you remember back when you were on the John Ankerberg show with Ken Hovind back in 2000, you at the end of that debate, you literally, I could see the emotions coming out. You had this prayer of that you wish that all these models could be put forward in an academic format, and only now, I guess, because of the rise of the internet and all that, we've been able to the world has been able to join together, and I guess Christendom has been able to become scientifically sophisticated, where it's not just left to the scientists. Now theologians are joining in that discussion, and so therefore you were able to get into this discussion with the Counterpoints book,
Right.
and I firmly believe that your prayer was answered in this book, because here you've been able to have the models join together, and so maybe if you want to touch on that as well, I don't mind.
Well, what I liked about that book is that the 4 presidents had to state their position, and because the other 3 were present, there was an honest presentation of where they stood and why. And but in writing that book, I was impressed at how little the other presidents understood what my position was. I mean, they all thought that I held a very different view of Genesis. And when I realized, for example, neither Deborah Harzma nor Ken Ham had actually read any of my material on Genesis. So, but I think they're reading it now. So hopefully
Right.
it's
Right. Okay. Well, let's get the Q&A going. So, who would like to go first? And you'll have a dedicated 15 to 20 minutes of time. I'll try and stretch it to 20 minutes.
I can go first.
I guess I'll. Who?
If that's okay.
Wait, which one? Wayne, Hunter?
Yeah,
I'll go first.
Okay.
If
Hunter,
that's
you
okay.
go.
Okay, awesome. Hi, Dr.
You're
Hugh.
breaking up.
Oh, I am? Am I breaking up?
No,
I
you're
can
not
hear you
working.
now.
No.
Okay. My question is simply because I come from an atheist background to becoming a born again Christian, and going into one of the most questions I always get asked about is about the Genesis creation days. And I've read a lot of your material and just love your work whatsoever. Just huge fan. But I'm still having trouble with answering the question with day 3 and day 4. With the vegetation, how that came about, and then sunlight supposedly came after. At least that's what I get from people who go for the young Earth creation model, or atheists who bring that up to me and everything. So I have a hard time kind of really figuring out what to say and how to say it. If you could definitely help me out with that.
Sure. I think it's most important to realize that the frame of reference changes from Genesis 1:1 to Genesis 1:2. So the first verse is talking about the universe. But when you go to the second verse, it says the Spirit of God is hovering over the surface of the waters of planet Earth, which tells us we're to interpret the account of the 6 days from that point of view, from the point of view of an observer underneath the atmosphere, sitting on the ubiquitous waters that are covering the earth. And so when it says it's dark upon the surface of the waters, It's not dark because the sun doesn't exist. It's dark because sunlight can't get through the Earth's atmosphere. And that's actually explicitly stated in Job 38. Job 37, 38, and 39 is actually a much longer text on the days of creation. It's not chronological, but you get way more scientific detail in those 3 chapters in Job. And I think it's important, too, to understand that Moses' audience already had the book of Job. So Moses did not repeat what the people already had in that lengthy creation text in Job. And what Job 38, 8, and 9 tell us is that God had blanketed the seas with clouds that kept the seas dark. So notice there's explicit as to why it's dark. It's dark because the cloud layers would not let light pass through. Now, as an astronomer, I knew that right away because any planet the size of Earth will have an opaque atmosphere to start with. For example, Venus's atmosphere is still opaque to all visible light except deep red. And Earth's atmosphere at that time was 3 times thicker. So there's no way any visible light would get through to the surface. And when you get to creation day 1, notice it says, let there be light. It doesn't say God created the light or made the light. It says, let the light be. The light would have been created in the beginning when God created the universe. So light was pervasive throughout the universe, but it was dark on the surface of the waters. And the miracle of creation day 1 is God transforming the atmosphere from opaque to translucent. But not until the 4th day did the atmosphere become transparent. And this is clear because of what you see in verse 14. Let there be the great lights, so that they may serve as signs to mark seasons, days, and years. And what I noticed when I first read chapter 1 is that all the life mentioned before the 4th day doesn't need to know where the sun, moon, and stars are in the sky. But all the life described after the 4th day needs to know where the sun, moon, and stars are. And so let there be light, or let there be the great light, so they may serve as signs. It's the animals that need those signs. And so what happened on creation day 4, the atmosphere went from translucent to transparent. Now, the other question you raise is, what do you do with the vegetation? Well, if you look at creation day 3, it begins with this phrase, let the land masses produce desheh. That's the Hebrew word for photosynthetic life. And then it gives 3 examples, and they're translated into English as trees, fruit, and seeds. But the original Hebrew words are much more generic than the English specifics. And moreover, those 3 are not intended to be a complete list. So we have a general statement, let the continental land masses produce vegetation. Here are 3 different kinds of that vegetation that will be produced. And there's actual scientific evidence now that land plants predate the first sea animals by 600 million years. So the old saw that there was a conflict between creation day 3 and creation day 4 has been resolved by this discovery of fossils of plants. Now, to be clear, they've yet to find a complete plant fossil previous to the Cambrian and Avalon explosions, but they have found fossil parts. The biggest part is 1 millimeter across, but that's more than adequate to establish that indeed the continents had vegetation upon them hundreds of millions of years before the first appearance of animals. And actually that would be necessary just to get the oxygen content up to what the animals would need. So does that help?
Yeah, and if I could ask, where can I find this material for the plant life base fossils being found before animal life base? Like, do you have certain recommendations or?
If you've got the book Navigating Genesis, it's all in there with citations to the scientific literature. The other thing I put in Navigating Genesis is an analysis by some really good Hebrew scholars on Genesis 1:1 and 1:2, making the point that the way the verbs are placed in those two sentences tells us there is a passage of time between Genesis 1:1 and 1:2 and between 1:2 and 1:3. So what I share with my young earth friends, even if you're fixated on these days being 24 hours, the text still allows for an indefinite period of time before the beginning of creation, day one.
That was awesome. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Another thing I find helps my young earth friends is to show them that without any access to a Hebrew lexicon, you can tell that the word for day must have at least 3 distinct literal definitions, because 3 are actually used in the text. Creation day 1, it's daylight hours. Creation day 4, 24 hours. Genesis 2:4 uses the word day to refer to the entirety of creation history. And I found that helpful to convince my younger friends that looking at the days as 6 consecutive long periods of time are indeed 6 literal days. It's one of the literal definitions.
Thank you so much.
You're
That's
welcome.
a lot of help. That's a lot of help.
Okay, good.
Oh, Hunter, you still have 10 minutes. I was just wanting to point out, I put the link to that Nature article. It's the late Precambrian greening of the Earth in 2009, using the citation and navigating Genesis. And if you can recall, Michael Shermer was making a great, claim that, oh, look, in Genesis there's a contradiction. And sure enough, a couple of months later, after your debate with Michael Shermer, a paper came out showcasing that the chronology that you were arguing for actually fits with, the scientific evidence with
Yeah.
that 2009 paper. Yeah.
And there's another paper that came out in 2011 where they not only found isotope evidence, but actual fossils.
Right. Go ahead, Hunter, if you have another question. I don't mind.
Well, actually, it was in regards of the Noah's flood idea, actually, as well. So you hold to the, if I'm not mistaken, the worldwide flood. Is that correct? Or
The world of the ungodly. That's 2 Peter 2:5. It says the world of the ungodly was flooded. You can
Okay.
also 2 Peter 3:5 and 6, which says in Greek, cosmos tote was flooded. And cosmos is world. Tote means the world that existed at that time. So what you notice in 2 Peter, whenever Peter refers to the flood, he qualifies the word cosmos with an adjective, which tells you it's not the whole globe. Otherwise, there'd be no adjectives. So anywhere where ungodly people lived, that was flooded. But it's obvious there were no ungodly people living in Greenland and Antarctica at that time. So God wouldn't have flooded Greenland or Antarctica. I don't think there are any emperor penguins on board the ark.
right. Well, okay. In regards to that, I was wondering, like, how far do you think this flood, like from east to west, covered? And do we have any like geological evidence of this?
Yeah, I write about that in Navigating Genesis, making the point that if you look at the text in Genesis 8, it says it took 7.5 months for the waters to recede so that the ark could land on dry land. Or to take that long for the waters to recede, there had to be significant ice in the vicinity. So I believe Noah's flood took place during the last ice age, because there's no way it would take that long for the waters to recede unless you're in an ice age. And so that being the case, I have a map in Navigating Genesis of how extensive the flood was. It's about 4 times bigger than your standard old Earth model, because the standard old Earth model puts it in the interglacial, whereas my model, the flood happens when the Persian Gulf is dry land. And so It not only flooded Mesopotamia, it flooded all of the Persian Gulf, flooded large portions of Arabia and Iran. And basically, my flood model is about 4 times bigger than the standard old Earth creationist model. I actually got to present that model in front of a bunch of young Earth global flood theologians. And I said, hey, I've made the flood 4 times bigger. If you guys will make your flood about 4 times smaller, we can actually metal and settle all this. But I think what really settles it are the references to creation day 3 in Psalms, Proverbs, and Job. There are 5 texts that you'll find, and I cite them all in Navigating Genesis. But it's compelling in the sense that it describes creation day 3, where for the first time God establishes continents. So it's not water over the whole face of the earth, we have oceans and continents. But what you'll see in Psalm 104, verse 9, for example, is that once these continents are in place, never again will water cover the whole face of the earth. And there's 4 repetitions of that in Job and Psalms and Proverbs. So I show that to my friends who think the flood was global in extent and said, hey, without any reference to science, the Bible itself eliminates the possibility of a global flood. Although what I found what really interesting is that when I put that in front of Ken Ham, he said, well, Hugh, those are poetic texts. And, poetry basically doesn't count. I got to see it as narrative prose before I really believe it. But my response to that is, it's not like English poetry. Hebrew poetry is designed to be a powerful tool for didactic teaching. And if you don't believe that, go to the book of Isaiah, and the most specific and detailed didactic teaching in the Old or New Testament is Isaiah 40 through 48 on the doctrine of the Trinity. And it's 100% poetry. So I argue that poetry is on an equal footing with narrative and with prose in declaring truth. But yeah, I do find it amusing that my young Earth friends basically discount the poetic texts of the Bible.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much. And do I have time for one more question or?
Yep. Go one more.
Okay.
We can try and fit in.
And Dr. Hugh actually came across it was kind of like a 4 perspectives of creation between yourself, Ken Ham, Deborah Harmsa, I think is the name, and Stephen Meyer. It was creation, evolution, and intelligent design.
Right.
And I came across it by the grace of God, and I was actually want to know if you can kind of explain that book just a little bit and your ideas with the 4 comparisons and everything with you 4.
Yeah, it's a book where each of us were told to make an opening statement, but to close our statement with what we thought were the greatest scientific challenges to our position and the greatest biblical challenges to our position. Not all 4 authors really fully cooperated in that, but that's what we were asked to do. And then each of us responded to the other 3 essays, and then we were given 1,000 words to respond to the responses. So that's kind of what the book was like. And we were told that we were to comment on creation, evolution, and Genesis. You notice the book title got changed because Stephen Meyer did not want to comment on Genesis. So for his sake, they changed the title. But the rest of us, we did comment on Genesis. So, but what interested me was how all 4 authors claimed to believe in biblical inerrancy, but all of them had very different definitions of biblical inerrancy. Although I would say Steve Meyer's definition is quite close to mine, but Deborah's and Ken's were very different. I thought that was useful for the authors to all precisely state what they thought biblical inerrancy was and what their belief was.
Awesome. Thank you so much.
And just quickly, Hugh, on that book, before we go to the next questioner, I actually picked up on what I consider to be the disingenuous nature of Ken Ham. I mean, I apologize for saying that, but it has to be said, because in that book, he thinks that you made a mistake with the mean deviation of the fine structure constant, and he actually in the book says that he contacted Danny Faulkner, and then Danny Faulkner is making the claim that you made an error, and then but you thankfully clarify that in your response, saying no, the way you took out, you extrapolated the scientific notation, you were actually on point, and you were on point because I looked at the original paper, and I'm just thinking to myself, Danny Faulkner should have actually told Ken Ham. I mean, he's an astronomer. He claims to, he has a PhD and so on. He should know the math on how to do these calculations, and he tells Ken Ham that yes, Ken Ham, you are right, that Hugh Ross is wrong, that Hugh Ross is not reading the material correctly. And because I'm the scientist, I'm currently a master's in engineering, so I know how to, derive equations. And when I see stuff like that, I just see a disingenuous spirit, which is that something that affects you as well in that sense? Like, I mean, we're just seeing it
Well,
in that book.
yeah, Danny Faulkner has done that more than once. And the thing with Danny is he never gives his opponent the benefit of the doubt. It's like, okay, Hugh's an astronomer. He probably knows what he's talking about. Maybe I better read the paper a little more carefully and see if what Hugh put down there is actually precise. If he had done that, there would have been no issue. But the thing I noticed with Danny, he always assumes I'm wrong, and therefore never, and I have to keep correcting him. So, and he passes it on to Ken. Ken just assumes that Danny's done his homework. So,
Right. But I mean, it's there for everyone to see, and really, when it comes down to looking at this material in a dry way, where there's no bias and so on, you'll see that Hugh, comes out on top in that sense. So you come out on top,
well, thank you.
and model, yeah. Okay, Wayne, can you go next? Like, is your connection all right?
Can you hear me?
Yep.
And can you see me? Because I'm on my
Yes.
phone, so it might be terrible. Okay.
Yep, go ahead. Yeah.
Okay. Hey, Dr. Ross, how you doing?
Doing well, thank you.
Well, it's nice to finally meet you. And I did want to say, I've spoken with you on about 3 or 4 other occasions, you and Dr. Rana, and welcome back.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So one of my questions to you is, I have it right here in my notes. So as far as the Big Bang model goes, there are some scientists like Sean Carroll, some famous atheists who they will argue and they would say that we don't know if there's a beginning to the universe yet. But I know you argue that there is. So what data would finally put this conversation to a halt?
Well, I actually take on Sean Carroll's quantum eternity theorem in the latest edition of The Creator and the Cosmos. And, I make the point that his quantum eternity theorem is based on what we can't know and measure. And you can always escape any conclusion by appealing to the unknown. So an example I give in the book is, I've been married to my wife for 40 years, but I could actually appeal to the unknown and draw the conclusion she doesn't exist. But the error in all of that is 100% of the observational experimental evidence tells me my wife really does exist. Likewise, 100% of the observational experimental evidence tells us the universe has a beginning. And I make the point in The Creator and the Cosmos that we actually can penetrate the quantum gravity era, because that's what Sean Carroll does. He says, well, we only know the physics of the universe back to 10 to the minus 43 seconds after the so-called beginning of the universe. And maybe there's exotic physics going on when the universe is extremely young and extremely dense and hot. And if there's really strange physics going on, maybe we can escape the beginning. And he throws us some physics that would actually show us that we would escape that beginning. But he's been presuming that that era could not be penetrated by science. and therefore he would say we Christians have not ruled out all possibilities. Well, the problem is we humans are constrained by space and time of the universe. It's impossible for us to exhaustively gain every bit of knowledge about the universe. So there'll always be some part that we're ignorant about. But what he was really appealing to in his quantum gravity theorem was that maybe during that extremely early era of the universe, there were quantum space-time fluctuations so large that there may be an escape out of the space-time theorems. And what I was pointing out is we now have observations of distant quasars and blazars, and that there is really big quantum space-time fluctuations, it would make the images of these quasars and blazars blurry, and we can't see any blurriness. The images measure to be sharp. Now, I can see Sean Carroll saying, well, okay, you eliminated some of the quantum gravity models, but there are others that will allow me to escape the beginning. But what I'm demonstrating is the more we learn about the universe, the smaller and smaller corner the atheist is painting himself into. And that should tell us something, that there really is overwhelming evidence that the universe had a beginning. Everything we know and measure tells us it has a beginning, and the more we learn, the stronger that evidence becomes. But will we ever have absolute proof that the universe has a beginning? No. Just like I'll never have absolute proof that my wife exists. But what I would say to Sean Carroll, if the evidence for the existence of God is stronger than the evidence for the existence of my wife, shouldn't we all believe in the existence of God?
I think that was a very wonderful answer. Another question I had for you is it's right here in my notes again, and it is, as far as Genesis goes, I myself I hold to an accommodationist approach, like Deborah Henderson from BioLogos.
Mhm.
So I would challenge you, Dr. Ross, and I would say that Genesis doesn't have any science in it, but what would demonstrate to you that Genesis isn't a scientific text, but it could have been written as a polemic? And of course, God still exists.
Well, I do think it is written as a polemic. My view in Genesis 1 is that it's serving multiple purposes. We notice that the text is also introducing the doctrine of the Trinity. I have friends that are framework hypotheses. I say, I can accept your framework hypothesis. It's just that I don't think that Genesis is limited to the framework hypothesis. It's more than that. And one reason I'm persuaded that Genesis 1 is intended to communicate scientific history is it's set up as a chronology. Now, I've discussed this frequently with Deborah Harzma and other leaders of BioLogos, just saying, because they make the point that we should not take Genesis 1 as a chronology. But I said, look at the way it's set up. You got these days. You got the repeated phrase, and it was so. You got the repeated phrase, it was good. Look at the verb structure. As I've talked to Hebrew scholars on this, it's like there is no other text in the Old Testament that has more clues or more content telling us that this is a chronology of actual events. So if it's a chronology of actual events, then it actually must have scientific content in it. And therefore, it's our job to see how credible that scientific content is. And as I've discussed this with my friends of BioLogos, they're persuaded that the scientific content, if you take Genesis as chronological, contradicts the established scientific record. So the reason they strip Genesis of scientific content, they don't think it can be defended if you leave it in. And I saw that in that Four Views book, because Deborah basically thought, well, if you take this as actual history, as a chronology, you got a huge problem. But she didn't understand our model. She thought the point of view we were taking in the text was from above the earth looking down the earth. And I told her, well, if that's the point of view, I agree with you. Genesis 1, if we take it as history, is teaching scientific nonsense. but that's not what the text says. The text puts the point of view on the surface of the earth. And from that point of view, you got a perfect fit with the established scientific record. So the other thing I would point out too is that for 19 centuries, Christians have seen this as an historical account. So I don't think the Holy Spirit would allow 19 centuries of Christians to get it that wrong.
Rob, how much time do I have? Because I did want to ask one more question.
You got 10 minutes. So
Okay.
You can go.
Okay. I guess another one of my questions to you. Well, you know what, Dr. Ross, I'm sorry because I don't think I got an answer to the second part of my question. It was to you, in your opinion, what evidence will falsify your belief that Genesis is a scientific account? So what could you see that would make you second guess that?
Oh, what it would take would be some textual evidence that there's no chronology and no history in the text. And, my friends of Biologos would try to persuade me that the numbering of the days has got nothing to do with history. The repeated phrases have got nothing to do with history. On the other hand, what I notice is they're not Hebrew scholars. The people that are fluent in biblical Hebrew, everyone I've talked to says, yeah, it really is an historical text. So, but if someone were to convince me that indeed there is nothing in the original Hebrew communicating a chronology or history, that would change my point of view in Genesis 1.
Okay. I guess that will lead me to another question as to when you read the Genesis account, of course, you know this, Dr. Ross, from an ancient Near Eastern perspective, their cosmology of the world was very different. And so they believed that the earth was flat. And you can see this in the New Testament, where Jesus is shown the kingdoms of the world from a mountain. Now, the earth is round, and we know that can't happen. So I would ask you, this is my last question to you. How would you tackle that?
Well, again, I've had long discussions with my friends of Biologos about this, saying, hey, if you actually read ancient Egyptian astronomy and ancient Greek astronomy, this idea that they believed the world was flat is simply not true. They had measured the sphericity of the Earth to 1% precision. They noticed that the constellations actually turn upside down when you go from north to south. They were able to measure the shadow of sunlight shining down wells as you go from north to south. That's how they're able to measure the sphericity of the Earth. They knew that it was heliocentric because they could determine from just plain geometry that the sun was much bigger than the Earth. They knew roughly the distance to the sun and the moon. And I also pointed out that we astronomers actually use ancient Egyptian astronomical records that are more than 3,000 years old to build superior models of the interior of stars, because they actually recorded the timing of variable stars to about 2-minute precision. And so we're able to actually use that ancient data to show how stars have evolved over the 3,000 years of history since then. And, I think what makes all of us astronomers envious is there was a time in the history of the Egyptian Empire when 25% of their national income went to support astronomy. So their astronomy was not primitive. And this idea that they believed in, a flat earth with a metal dome over it with holes in it that let rain through, not even in Babylon do you have a majority of the priestly leaders believing that. There were some that did, but I heard a talk by an archaeologist pointing out that was a minority point of view, even in Babylon and Assyria. And therefore, this idea that was a pervasive view throughout the Middle East is simply not incorrect. Now, don't get me wrong. I do think Genesis 1 is a polemic against ancient Near Eastern creation myths. And that when you look at Genesis 1, it's radically different from those myths. That's a debate I had with Deborah Harzma on it, because she thought that Genesis and these ancient Near Eastern stories of creation were similar. And says, no, it's like their differences are far greater than the similarities. And also, I make the point that I think a lot of this goes away when we realize that Creation Day 2 is talking about the water cycle. And again, there's a lot of debate on this, and it's cryptic. Creation Day 2 just has a single sentence, but that's because the parallel account in the book of Job, there's a chapter and a half on Creation Day 2. So again, given that the people already had the content of the book of Job, Moses could afford to be really brief on what he said about Creation Day 2. So once we understand it's talking about the water cycle, a lot of this speculation about Near Eastern myths goes away. And you'll see some of that in the Four Reviews book. But we actually debated that at length at a BioLogos conference.
Well, that is all the questions I pretty much had. But thank you, Dr. Ross, for your time. And I guess we can move on to the next questionnaire.
Right, thanks, Wayne. And yeah, just to quickly touch on that, you mentioned in Navigating Genesis about algol. The Egyptians actually had a sophisticated means by maybe just spend a minute describing that, just to flesh out what you've just been saying with respect to advanced knowledge and yeah.
The Egyptians were interested in variable stars. Algol is one of the brightest of the variable stars. It's the second brightest star in the constellation Perseus. And it's an eclipsing variable star. About every 2 3/4 days, it goes through an eclipse. And the Egyptians were interested in it. And so they studied it literally every few days. And they were able to measure the period of that eclipsing variable to 4.5 places of the decimal. Today we can measure it to 7 places of the decimal, but we're able to compare the period that the Egyptians had measured, and it's actually different from the period we measure today. They were able to use that difference to come up with a superior model for the interior physics of Algol and apply that to a whole lot of other eclipsing variable stars. So yeah, we astronomers today are actually mining the astronomical records of the ancient Egyptians in order to better understand the interior physics of stars.
Right, and it just goes to show that it's not a, monolithic, like a universal belief in the general, flat Earth cosmology that is mostly presented by scholars like John Walton and just little things like this, which are recent discoveries, by the way.
Well, they are, and I know John quite well, and he was trying to claim both personally and in his book that the ancients didn't care 2 bits about astronomy. They had no interest in astronomy whatsoever. And I says, look, they've got written records. Look at it. They cared more about astronomy than we do today.
Right. Yeah. And you also encourage Christians, since the Genesis question, to look at the hexameron, early church father material on the creation account. And I've actually been doing that recently. I've been spending the last 6 months looking through it. And again, I was astonished to find out, like what you just said about early perspectives of, in this case, heliocentrism of, sure enough, they had, like Anaximander had a perspective of a spherical Earth, but they didn't actually flesh out a so-called heliocentric model. But Clement of Alexandria in the 2nd century takes the menorah, and the center candle of the menorah he designates as the sun, where the other 6 planets, because they only knew of 7 planets, so the 3 on each side will go around the sun. And it's just statements like that just make me go, wow, it's they're tucked away. It's just, unfortunately, it's not like out in the open.
Well, even Ptolemy knew that the heliocentric model was correct. The reason why he framed the solar system from a geocentric perspective, he didn't have algebra. And without algebra, the only way you can predict the future positions with any accuracy of the planets is to do it from a geocentric perspective. And so it was a mathematical tool. It was not meant to communicate the reality of the solar system. And it was Copernicus who actually went to the Italian libraries and discovered that long before Ptolemy, the Greek and Egyptian astronomers had figured out it was heliocentric. But we need to realize not until the 9th century AD did we have algebra. And without algebra, you really can't come up with accurate positions of the planets from a heliocentric perspective.
Oh, this is exciting. Yeah, because I can immediately connect with. There's a mathematician on the east side of Australia. I'm on the west side in Perth. You came in 2014, and you and I met in UWA. He's in University of New South Wales. His name is Norman Wildberger, a great mathematician. He has a dedicated YouTube channel on basically the history of math, going way back, before Euclid as well. And he himself has said exactly what you just said. It's a mathematical issue, and surprisingly, when you actually flesh out the details and we find more discoveries, that they had a lot more sophisticated, more correct ideas of the solar system than we used to think. So
Well, it's astronomy that drove
yeah.
mathematical history. I mean, without astronomy, we probably wouldn't have calculus at this day.
That's true. Yeah.
Isaac Newton invented calculus because he needed it to solve the problem he was working on with the planets.
Right. Okay, who would like to go next, Tony or Hound?
I can go if you want.
Okay.
All right. So I think Wayne mostly asked a lot of what I wanted to ask. So just to follow up on what he said there and what you said earlier, when you said that you see Genesis as doing multiple things simultaneously. So what parts do you find interesting from other people's models of Genesis 1 that you think are sort of important to know outside of your personal research?
Well, I've really appreciated dialogues I've had with people who hold to the framework hypothesis, where they make the point that Genesis 1 is communicating what's going on in the heavenly creation. And that they claim a mistake is we think it's only focused on the earthly creation. And I'm open to the idea that Genesis 1 may be communicating something about the heavenly creation. And so I like the idea that maybe we've been overlooking something. However, I am of the opinion that it's predominantly focused on the earthly creation. But I'm open to the idea that maybe it's communicating something about what's actually going on in heaven. And that creation predated. I mean, my framework friends make the point that the heavenly creation predates the earthly creation. And so what we see here is a pattern of the heavenly creation. So I'm open to that kind of thinking. And what I notice about my friends who are framework hypotheses, they used to be labeled as people who deny any chronology in Genesis. And in my latest dialogues with them, they said, no, that's an overstatement. We do believe the universe is first, and then you got the origin of life, and then the origin of humanity. It's just that we're not willing to take it anywhere past that. And it says, not because we don't think it can be done, we're not scientists. And so we're only comfortable pushing it as far as our limited scientific knowledge. So I think that's a big help, because for decades, people have thought that the framework people were anti-chronology. No, they're partial chronology.
Nice. Also, a question from a friend of ours who was unable to make it, sadly. He wanted to see if you could give give us a rundown of your view of the genealogy in Genesis 5 and how you deal with the ages listed as it relates to the argument for a short time between Adam and Noah.
Sure. Well, notice that the genealogy list in Genesis 5 and Genesis 11, each one is 10 names. And this is something you see in all the Old Testament genealogies. They like even numbers. And you see this in Luke, where it talks about there being 3 sets of 14 generations between Adam and between Jesus. But if you compare them with the genealogies in Chronicles, you notice a whole bunch of names got dropped out. And that's actually the case with every Old Testament genealogy. None of them are intended to be exhaustive. They're giving you the highlights, and the highlights typically are communicating a theological point. So notice that some genealogies differ from others, and that they make a special point of mentioning the women and others of mentioning people who have, quote, terrible sins. And so they'll point out, well, there is a prostitute, a female prostitute that's in the genealogy that leads to Jesus. So it's making the point that the gospel is not just for men, it's for men and women. It's not just for blood descendants of Abraham, it's for anyone who chooses to become part of God's people. Because notice how many Gentiles are mentioned in the genealogies. So I tell people, if you want to dig out the theology of the genealogies, look at the names that are included and look at the names that are dropped out. Now, I think what's going on in Genesis 5 and 11, especially Genesis 5, you're getting the names of the patriarchs who died natural deaths. I mean, this is something I write in Navigating Genesis, that in the days before the flood, the vast majority of humans were having their lives terminated by being murdered by their fellow human beings. The names we see listed in Genesis 5 are those few individuals that did not end their life by being murdered. In fact, in order to explain why the human population the days before the flood was as low as it was, the death rate by murder had to exceed 90%. In fact, I argue that the average longevity of human beings is probably longest now, actually longer than it was in the days before the flood, when God gave people the capacity to live past 900 years. Only a few individuals are actually living out their natural lifespan. The vast majority are being killed off at age 20, 30, and 40 by being murdered by their fellow man. Also explains why God had to intervene with a flood. He was basically saving humanity from self-extermination. They were on the verge of exterminating themselves, so he stepped in to prevent that from happening and basically gave a restart. And what you see in Genesis 11, again, are individuals who lived out their normal life, but notice the lifespans are declining exponentially. Because what you see in Genesis 6:3 is that God was going to shorten the maximum lifespan from approximately 970 years down to approximately 120 years. And you actually see that decline in lifespan in the Genesis 11 genealogy. But given that Genesis 8 clearly puts Noah's flood during the last ice age, that right away tells us that there's significant numbers of names dropped from the genealogy. So I'm comfortable with a date for Adam and Eve anywhere between, say, 15,000 and 130,000 years ago, because that would have been the last ice age. Genesis 2, by the way, tells us that 4 rivers come together in the Garden of Eden. They can only come together if you're living during an ice age.
So how do you deal with like the really odd math about the patriarchs' ages and deaths and the time they have their kids? What's your thought on that?
Well, I've talked to a number of Hebrew scholars on this, and they say, yeah, because English has an enormous vocabulary, in Hebrew a very tiny one, it's just not easy to translate those mathematical numbers from biblical Hebrew into English. And they make the point that the translation could easily sustain someone giving rise to a line rather than an actual son that's from the father. And therefore, there's plenty of room for drop names. So if you're interested, there's a physicist and a Hebrew scholar who wrote a piece on the Genesis 5 and 11 genealogies, and it's posted on our reasons.org website. Hugh Henry and I'm trying to think of Hugh Henry and Dan Dyke. If you look up their names, you'll see a couple of papers that they wrote. You can read them for free on our website.
So how much time do I have, Robert?
You have like 8 minutes, so I don't know if you want to. Yeah, you have 8 minutes.
Yeah. So General here brought up something interesting to me before on the subject of the ancients using a base 60 system. Have you heard of that interpretation before?
Yeah, base 16, right?
Base.
Base 60. So in Genesis 5, Dennis Lamoureux, for example, and I think John Walton's touched on this, that the Sumerian king list seems to match exactly, the 10 names given with corresponding with the Sumerian king list, and so therefore, because I understand in navigating Genesis, you have Adam potentially living for 930 years in a base 10 context, but if we use a base 60 approach, therefore those are not real figures, and therefore they're symbolic, which means they didn't live for that long. And
I've actually had a personal conversation with John Walton about this, and says, yeah, if you use your base 60 system, then you've got the patriarchs giving birth to children when they're 5 years of age. And that's biologically quite challenging. We have no evidence of a 5-year-old man being able to sire a child. Therefore, I think there's reason to be skeptical about the base 60 system. Moreover, you really don't have any indisputable evidence that they were using that system. I mean, I looked at John Walton's references on this, and it's highly speculative. I don't think the ancients were using a base 60 system at all. But I mean, that's what they do to try to come up with, okay, you can't live that long. And this is something I actually address in Navigating Genesis. Yes, humans cannot live that long today, but in the days before the flood, there was a potential for them living that long. And I cite the work of a British and a Russian astronomer who've been working for, almost 5 decades now on a supernova that erupted during the last ice age that's been determined to be responsible for 95% of the killer cosmic rays. Most cosmic rays are electrons and protons, but you do have some fast-moving heavy nuclei cosmic rays, and Ehrlichen and Wolfendale demonstrated all those cosmic rays come from a single supernova eruption that exploded in the last 100,000 years, really close to planet Earth. That being the case, we can imagine that people living before that supernova event would have only been exposed to electron and proton cosmic rays, in which case they wouldn't be subject to the damage that we're facing today. Incidentally, that by itself is not enough to explain the long lifespans. You also have to have humans isolated from igneous rocks, which is one reason why I think humanity was local before the flood. Because of their local and living in sedimentary plains, they would have been well isolated from igneous rocks and therefore not exposed to the amount of uranium that I'm exposed to living here in California. And then also you have to be on a vegetarian diet, but notice that's what the text says. Humans were on a vegetarian diet by biblical command until Genesis chapter 9. And then also you would need to adjust the telomerase activity in human chromosomes. If you don't have cosmic rays to worry about, or the radiation from uranium and thorium decay to worry about, you don't need aggressive telomerase activity. What I'm referring to is the fact that our chromosomes are designed to get shorter and shorter as we get older and older. And that guarantees that none of us are going to live past about 120. But that's actually a good thing, because if it wasn't for the shortening of those chromosomes, we'd be dying much earlier deaths from cancer. And so I basically make the point that it is scientifically feasible for humans to live 900 years if you take into account these 4 factors.
all right, no worries.
All right,
And
thank you very much.
That's something that Hound and myself are looking into still. Like we haven't really set up foot on, whether it's literal 900 plus years, because we like to dabble in the ancient area stuff. But I appreciate the model, the scientific model that you're trying to propose.
Well, where I do agree with John Walton, he makes the point that you see in the ancient Assyrian tablets the claims that the first kings did live much longer lives than we do. So
Right.
it's not just in the Bible where you see these claims for early people living much longer lifespans than people after the flood. So
By 100-fold as well, like 10,000 plus years for this game.
I mean,
Yeah.
however, I'm okay with that because when I read their stuff, they exaggerate all over the place.
Right.
So just on that issue where you see exaggeration.
Right. Okay, since Tony isn't here, my lovely partner Erin from Hawaii, by the way. So I was actually in Hawaii at the start of this year, and it's a beautiful place. And so yeah, she's phoning in from there, and you can go ahead and ask your question.
Yeah, awesome to have you on here, Dr. Ross. Thanks for taking the time to be here.
You're welcome.
Yeah, I have a few questions I typed out. The first one is, do the recent findings of MU69's occultations and possible binary composition lend further credence to the fine-tuning argument and the formation of the solar system itself?
Okay, what was the occultation you're referring to?
The MU69, their discovery of that within the Kuiper Belt. MU69.
Yeah, they've
Yeah.
actually seen some Kuiper Belt objects being occulted, which basically makes the point that there are big objects out there. So they're thinking we may actually find objects the size of Pluto or bigger. I mean, the only object we found bigger than Pluto has been an Oort cloud object. But yeah, this discovery is causing people to think there may actually be some big bodies that we haven't yet found in the Kuiper Belt. And super telescopes that are coming online, they're going to have the power to actually detect things. So there's two 100-foot diameter plus telescopes that are going to come online in the next few years. And you got the James Webb Telescope, and that's part of what they want to use them for. And but I do think we were right to demote Pluto, because there's actually the possibility we could find as many as 30 objects bigger than Pluto in the outer part of the solar system.
Yeah, that's awesome.
And you're probably aware too that there's some speculation there may be a planet 10 times the size of Earth orbiting the solar system 50 times more distant than Neptune orbits us. And, several of my fellow astronomers are looking for that object right now.
When was that object first thought to be?
They haven't found it yet. What they found is several Oort cloud objects and Kuiper Belt objects where the orbits are crossing one another in a rather dense fashion. And they're saying that could be the gravitational signature of a massive planet very distant from the sun. And so they've actually narrowed down a part of the sky where that planet could be. And there's searches going on right now. On the other hand, there are ways to explain those orbital crossings without the planet. So the planet may not be there, and it might be there. And what you see described in my book, Improbable Planet, is that in order to explain the configuration of the 8 planets in our solar system, the solar system had to start with 10 planets, one of which got absorbed into the Earth in the moon forming event, and a third would be a planet like Uranus and Neptune that got kicked out of the solar system. But the model actually permits the planet not being entirely kicked out of the solar system, but kicked out to a very, very distant orbit. And so we're trying to figure out which of those two models is correct. And when we do, I think we're going to come up with even more fine-tuning evidence. That's something I'm looking forward to.
Yeah, that's exciting.
But my friends tell me it could be a 2 or 3 year search before we know which model is right.
Do objects within the Kuiper Belt help us find, for the fine-tuning argument for our solar system, in a sense, to keep it the way?
And you'll see this discussed in Improbable Planet, that we're actually seeing asteroid and comet belts around other planetary systems.
Mhm.
What we notice is that most of them have no asteroids or comets at all.
Mm.
That's because if the gas giants migrate in too close to the host stars, and in the vast majority of planetary systems, that's exactly what happens. The gas giants migrate in as close as Venus, Mercury, and Earth. And when that happens, it scatters all the asteroids and comets out. And so more than 90% of the planetary systems we observe, no comets, no asteroids. But the other 10%, the gas giant planets don't migrate at all. And when they don't migrate at all, you have asteroid and comet belts that are thousands of times bigger than ours. And what happened in our planetary system, the gas giant planets moved in to about the orbit of Mars, stopped, and moved back out. And it's that movement that reduced the comet and asteroid belts by about 99%. And so it's unique to our solar system. We have 5 asteroid and comet belts, but they're all small. And that's exactly what you need for advanced civilization. If you have no asteroids and comets at all, then you get a slow loss of water from the Earth. Now, we do lose water, but the water we lose is replaced by comets that bring water back. Comets are 85% water. So we get slow delivery of water to compensate the water that leaves. And also our civilization is dependent on the occasional metal-rich asteroid hitting the Earth. So for example, half the nickel that's in circulation in our economy came from an asteroid that hit in Sudbury, Ontario. 80% of our gold and platinum comes from an asteroid that hit in South Africa. So we do benefit from having the occasional collision event. It helps us, I mean, particularly the platinum group metals. If I believe it or not, NASA's actually found an asteroid in the near asteroid belt that they value at being worth over $10 quadrillion because it's loaded with gold and silver and platinum and osmium and palladium. And they're thinking, gee, maybe we should go out and grab that thing, bring it into an Earth orbit, and we can mine that thing, and we'll all be rich. So.
Oh, man, too much. Yeah, thank you for that. That's very helpful. I had a question in regards to Danny Faulkner. He identifies in one of his articles that scientists have found far fewer craters than expected on Pluto and Charon. He also notes that Pluto has only a finite amount of nitrogen gas as a small body. Yet currently we've discovered that it has a tenuous nitrogen atmosphere that should be depleted based on a 4.5 billion year age solar system. So based on this, how would you respond to these supposed young Earth creationist objections?
Well, I deal with this in a matter of days, how they come up with all these arguments, but they always leave critical things out. When you throw that back in there, I mean, what I tell my young Earth friends, well, if Danny Faulkner's got a point, you would expect that to be conceded by astronomers. We see no concession whatsoever. Every astronomer studying Pluto is convinced that it's billions of years old. Now, we don't know a whole lot about Pluto. And so what Danny's pointing out is that, there are holes in our understanding of Pluto. Well, everybody accepts that. That's why we want to send another mission to Pluto in order to find out what's really going on there. And, his nitrogen issue is interesting because when we look at other planetary systems, we see that they're much more nitrogen rich than the planets in the solar system. So for example, your typical Earth-like planet has 2,400 times as much nitrogen as the Earth does. And so how is it that we lost all that nitrogen? And I write about this in Improbable Planet and say, it's not only that we're nitrogen poor, we're also carbon poor, and we're helium poor. And so we now recognize that our solar system formed in a very dense cluster of stars much closer to the center of the galaxy, and was in the vicinity of supernova eruptions that bathed our planetary system with aluminum-26. Aluminum-26 is given off by supernova. It's a short-lived, highly radioactive isotope, and it actually blasted away all the light element material from our planetary systems. And Earth actually had more of it blasted away because of the moon forming event. So one of the unique things about the Earth is it's very poor in light elements and very poor in water. I mean, I find it amusing that NASA says follow the water, and I point out to my astronomy friends that's not a good strategy, because water is the third most abundant molecule in the universe. The universe is soaking wet, and the Earth-like planets that we have found where we can measure water, they're coming in with a minimum of 500 times as much water as the Earth. And I believe that the Earth also had a lot of water to begin with. If it didn't, the moon would have never formed. It was a planet colliding with the Earth when the Earth had oceans thousands of miles deep that allowed the collision to be a soft collision, not destroying the Earth, but actually allowing the collider to be absorbed in the Earth with a debris cloud that formed the moon. But because we have a very thin layer of water rather than a thick layer of water, we can have continents. And without continents and oceans cohabiting on the surface of the Earth, you can't recycle the nutrients that are essential for Earth. Moreover, you can't weather the silicates to compensate for the brightening of the sun. You would have only a tiny window in which light could exist on Earth. So this all fits into the fine tuning. And it's interesting, a personal debate I had with Danny Faulkner. He said, Hugh, the problem with your model, there's way too much fine tuning in it. I said, well, Danny, I think that's a good thing, not a bad thing.
That'd be bad. Yeah, that's ironic. So he doesn't hold to the anthropic principle then?
Well, he would say he does, but he says, you know, if you put too much fine tuning in it, then you have a contrived model. And my response to that is, well, we got these passages in Job and Psalms that tell us the more we learn about nature, the more evidence we're going to see for God's handiwork. And I interpret God's handiwork as fine tuning. So I would anticipate from a biblical point of view, we're going to see a whole lot of fine tuning. But yeah, my young Earth friends seem uncomfortable with that. They want a small amount of fine tuning, but not as much. And yeah, from an old Earth perspective, you get way more fine tuning than you do in a young Earth perspective. I think that's why they react to the fine tuning argument, because if you push it, then it kills the young Earth model. In order to get all that fine tuning, you can't do it in just 6,000 years.
Right. Thank you for that. I just have one more question. What are your thoughts on the A theory versus B theory of time, and which do you hold to and why?
Well, I hold to neither. It was in 2005 that I attended a conference in Cambridge University. And the speakers were 8 physicists and 8 philosopher theologians.
Mm-hmm.
What's interesting is that each of us had to debate someone in our discipline and debate someone who is outside the discipline. So the physicist I debated was John Polkinghorne, and the theologian philosopher I debated was Bill Craig. You know, Bill is the one that comes up with all these philosophical ideas on time. And my response to Bill was, that our whole debate was on God and time, was that, and he was basically saying that my view of time contradicted Augustine's view of time, and that we needed to go with Augustine's view of time and not Einstein's view of time. My response was, notice there's 15 centuries between Augustine and Einstein, and that the dictionaries have changed over that period of time. And I was arguing that if you were to put Einstein in the 5th century AD, he'd be saying exactly the same things as Augustine, and put Augustine in the 20th century, he'd be saying the same things as Einstein. But just recognize how the dictionaries have changed. They don't contradict one another. But my view is that God was temporal before he created time. So when Augustine says that God was dwelling in a timeless eternity, I don't think Augustine meant that God was not experiencing anything temporal. He was just simply saying that the time we experience today is different than the temporality God experienced before he created time. And so in my debate with Bill, I made the point, notice that God was planning redemption before he created anything. There are texts in the Bible that tell us that God begins his works of redemption before he creates anything. Now, cosmic time didn't exist until God created the universe. But we got God planning and doing things. Cause and effect is going on before time exists, before cosmic time exists. We also know biblical claims that God was in relationship before he created anything. The Father, Son, and Holy Spirit were in a loving relationship with one another. And I said a 20th century definition of time is that dimension or realm in which cause and effect phenomena take place and where relationships can grow and develop. And so if you use that definition of time, rather than these philosophical A-B theories of time, then I don't think we've got a contradiction between and Einstein.
Yeah, you having a contradiction, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, but yeah, I found it strange that Bill felt that Einstein's concepts of relativity were wrong. I said, no, I don't think they're wrong. I mean, as a physicist, there's overwhelming measurements, observations we have that both special and general relativity are correct, and that they're correct to 22 places in the decimal. So I think it's a bad idea for Christian philosophers to argue against Einsteinian time. But my whole point is it doesn't contradict what Augustine was saying about time, because Augustine also believed that God was involved in cause and effect phenomena before the existence of time. So rather than get into this A and B, maybe we need to actually think about, okay, how do people today define time, and how did Augustine's era define time?
Right. Well, that would explain more too, Jesus being able to come, here. If he's in he is beyond our dimension, our dimensions or 4 dimensions, so he could be in 10 or more. But that explains how he could actually come into being here, necessarily being temporal himself, right?
Right. Well, that was actually part of the debate I had with Bill, is to say, put time aside. We actually have evidence in particle physics and cosmology that there must be at least 6 more dimensions of space. Now, we're talking 9 dimensions of space rather than 3. What's to stop God from having multiple dimensions of time? Moreover, passages in the Bible that tell us a day of the Lord is like 1,000 years to God. A watch of the night, which is only 3 hours, is like 1,000 years. Psalm 90 is basically telling us God can arbitrarily compress time or expand time. Mathematically, that can only be done by a being that's got access to at least the equivalent of 2 dimensions of time. And another book I wrote, Beyond the Cosmos, I actually show you diagrams that basically prove that that can only be done by a being or an entity that's got access to at least the equivalent of a 2nd dimension of time. Now, I'll put an important caveat. I'm not saying that God moves and operates in 2, 3, or 4 dimensions of time. The space-time theorems tell us he can create them at will and remove them at will. And who's to say he doesn't have access to dimensions that are way beyond anything that's possible in space and time? I'm just saying that this idea that God dwells where there's no temporal experience going on and no spatial experiences going on, that's incorrect.
Right. Thanks for that. I won't take up any more time.
You're welcome.
Thanks so much.
Yeah. I mean, I have the Augustine quote here. He says, I see then that time is a certain kind of extension. Time, therefore, begins rather from the creation than creation from time, but both are from God. and that's again amazing because time has a physical introduction from ex nihilo. There's no, like what the Greeks are thinking, that it's eternal and so on. Yeah. Also, I think when you mentioned about, because I read Beyond the Cosmos, you introduce a 3D non-Euclidean perspective of time when you're dealing about that compressing and expanding of time. And I think that actually jives very well with early church thinking about the hypostasis argument of how God relates with the creation. So like how when Jesus incarnates, so the Logos, dwelling in flesh, that therefore even before the incarnation, any form of communicable attribute that God has, in order for that to function, he has to be emptied in some sense. He has like there's levels of emptiness he has to go through in order to even, and in this case, making those multiple time dimensions that you speak about, in order to then have a proximity that is like a Planck length
Right.
distance, from us, and yeah. So I don't know if you want to quickly touch on what I just said, like if you agree or,
No, I
but
do agree.
because that's
So,
what I was thinking of when you were writing that. Yeah.
Philippians 2 makes that point that God humbled himself and lowered himself, so he became less than what he was before the incarnation. And in Beyond the Cosmos, they use the analogy of a three-dimensional being leaving behind one space dimension and becoming a two-dimensional being. So just trying to give you an idea of what Jesus actually sacrificed in order to live with us and give us the example of a sinless life and a life of humility. I mean, would you be willing to throw away one of your dimensions in order to?
Right.
That's what Jesus did for us, and I think
Right.
he divested himself of way more than just one. And I also
Right.
make the point that when you look at what Jesus suffered on the cross, he was only on the cross between 6 and 9 hours. And yet we're told that during that time, he paid the atonement penalty for every human being who ever lived. But I make the point that that's God dying on the cross, not just a human being who's also God. And therefore, he could have chosen to experience eternal torment 40 billion times over infinite time. If he's got access to multiple dimensions of time, he can compress that infinite amount of suffering into just 6 to 9 hours.
And you see that's what I mean. That blows my mind in that sense. I mean, I guess between you and me, mathematically, it is simple math, relatively speaking. But for us it might be simple, for others it might not be. But then what really blows my mind is, even though I understand the math and we can make these models, the fact that the math is applicable to the theology, that the theology does have this extraordinary, uncanny complexity. If it's just a human-made figment, if it was the figment of the imaginations of these authors, these apostles and so on, and not only that, but the biblical text that, from the time of Moses onwards, there's this continuing thread of the same theology that comes right through, culminates in Jesus, and then you can flesh out all these complex ideas, uh, and it fits. I think is too remarkable and coincidental.
Well, I
That's
would
that's
agree,
another thing I've noticed. Yeah.
but I also think it gives us an appreciation for Hebrews 2:3 that anyone who really appreciates the depth of what Jesus has done for us, how can you turn down such a magnificent offer of redemption? And so I think often it's people not appreciating the depth of what Jesus suffered on our account on the cross. And these mathematical tools may not be right, but at least gives you an idea of the magnitude of what he went through on our behalf. And I've noticed in speaking to a lot of people who are not yet Christians, when they appreciate the magnitude of what God done for them, it humbles them and they repent. So I think these mathematical tools are helpful in communicating to people the depths of Jesus' love for them, that he would go through all that pain and suffering.
Hence the humorous touch that you had in Beyond the Cosmos, where instead of 10 to the 12, 7 magnitudes of order, you went infinity to the infinity to the infinity, and because to make the point, I mean, that you might as well just put it that way, and yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Okay, Tony, are you in the room?
Yes, I am.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay. Dr. Ross, my first question for you would be, in your opinion, why do you think the rise of Neo-Assyrianism, also known as young Earth creationism, is so prevalent, especially in America?
I think it goes back to the Scopes trial, where evangelicals were so humiliated by that trial that they said, we have to fight back. And so I think it's really a desire to strike back at scientists. And I kind of put it in the analogy I use is Acts 15. In Acts 15, you had Jewish believers really not wanting Gentiles to fellowship with them. So they said, what can we do to keep the Gentiles away? Well, we're going to tell them they have to be circumcised before they can join our congregation. And that was an effective barrier to keep them away. And I've noticed throughout church history that these church splitting controversies that have got nothing to do with the basic doctrines of the Christian faith, each one is targeting an unwelcome people group. And I can't think of anything more odious for a scientist or an engineer other than to tell them, look, if you want to be a Christian, you got to believe that the earth and the universe are less than 10,000 years. And so it's been a very effective tool to keep the scientists and engineers out of the church. And when I've debated young earth creationist scientists, what I notice is to a man and a woman, they treat the scientific community as an enemy to be destroyed rather than a mission field to be won. Just like what was going on in the early church. And therefore, I think we need to take on these church splitting controversies, get them resolved, but realize if we ever resolve this young earth controversy, it's probably going to be replaced by another controversy targeting an unwelcome people group. I don't know what the next unwelcome people group will be, but I can tell you this, I have an astronomer friend who got kicked out of 4 consecutive churches, not because he was preaching an old earth doctrine. In fact, he tried to keep his employment as an astronomer a secret. But he says inevitably people would find out I'm an astronomer, and on that basis alone, they would tell me I was no longer welcome to attend their church. So I think that's what's really going on. The other thing I think is causing it to persist is this idea that a loving, all-powerful God would not kill animals. And the old earth perspective has the death of animals taking place before the sin of Adam. And so they want to blame all animal death on the sin of Adam. But I like to point out to my young earth friends, Adam was not the first sinner. Satan was. And we have no evidence from the Bible on the date when Adam sinned. So he could have sinned long before God created the animals. And I also note that in Romans 5, it states that human death was introduced by Adam's sin, not animal death. Notice Romans 5:12 says, sin through death came to all people. Only people can sin. So Paul actually gives you 2 qualifications. This is a death that happens to those who sin, and it goes to all people. He didn't say all life. And so I've been able to persuade some of my young earth friends that, hey, this idea that an all-powerful, all-loving God would not tolerate the death of animals is a misplaced sentimentalism. Because notice that God saw fit to have his own son die so that we could live. Notice throughout all the New Testament epistles, the message, the only way you can live is to die. And therefore, I think it's a mistake to label death in all contexts as fundamentally evil.
Thank you for that. I only had one other question for you. In your book, A Matter of Days, you talk about a concept called young earth Darwinism.
Yes.
specifically the limits of natural selection and the puzzling fossil record. And I wondered if you could expand a little bit more than what you said in the book.
Right. I'm basically making the point that if you look at atheism, theistic evolution, old Earth creationism, young Earth creationism, it's the young Earth creationists that believe in evolution to the most extreme degree. Two places they need it. Their model says no carnivorous activity until Adam sinned. And so they need to have all these herbivores, or at least some of these herbivores, rapidly evolve into carnivores. And this is really dramatic evolution. When you consider sharks, for example, have a liver that's 1/3 their body weight. And so the whole anatomy of the shark would have to be changed to go from eating vegetable matter, being able to eat fat-rich flesh. And so a second place they have it is at Noah's flood, because they believe that the flood was global in extent, wiped out all land-dwelling animals, and they recognize that the ark would have had a limited carrying capacity. And so you would have millions of species of land life evolving from the few thousand that were on board the ark. And as many atheists, evolutionary biologists have pointed out, these young Earth creationists believe in evolution at a pace that's at least 10,000 times, if not 1,000,000 times greater than anything they've ever considered. Now, so I talk to my young Earth friends, they say, we don't believe in evolution. We believe in diversification. But the way they define diversification is exactly the way Darwinists define evolution. There is no difference. But yeah, I point out in navigating, navigating Genesis, that this idea that God created species with these super genomes that very rapidly diversified into all these creatures, it's biochemically impossible for that to happen. Any biochemist realizes that what they're hypothesizing is simply not possible given the physics of the universe. But keep in mind, young Earth creationists do believe that the laws of physics radically changed at the fall of Adam and at the flood. And by radical, they need the constants of physics to change in some cases by a factor of 1 billion times. But that can be countered by the fact that there's 7 places in the Bible that tell us the laws of physics do not change. And of course, we got measurements in astronomy that likewise verify that biblical claim that at no time in the past was there any change in the laws of physics. And incidentally, I found that to be probably the most effective tool for persuading young Earth creationists that the Bible is an old Earth book, just to point out all the places where it talks about the laws of physics not changing until the redemptive work of Jesus Christ has been completed. And that means that there's no room for altered laws of physics, and every young Earth model critically depends on radically altered physics.
Thank you. That's all I had for you.
Okay.
Thank you for your time.
You're welcome.
All right, I guess it's my turn now. So now, Hugh, have you heard of, or do you know about John Sailhammer, the Old Testament
Yes.
Hebrew scholar that passed away last year, I think?
Right.
Are you familiar with his Genesis Unbound book?
Yes, he sent me the manuscript before it was published. He wanted me to endorse it. And, I like John, so I sent him a kindly worded letter explaining why I couldn't endorse the book, and recommended that he get some good editors to work on the book. Because I said, there's actually parts of the book that contradict other parts of the book. And he actually admitted that. He says, yes, what I'm trying to do is reconcile young Earth and old Earth. And so it's interesting that you caught those spots where I'm basically saying something different in one part of the book and the other. But he says, my passion is to bring together these two camps. And my whole point is that's kind of like trying to convince a woman on Monday she's pregnant and the next day she's not pregnant. You know, there really isn't a way you can reconcile these 2 points of view. But I said, I do think it's possible to get the 2 camps talking to one another charitably. And I argued that maybe that's what you should put in your book, John. Just emphasize that this is a debate that's doing damage to the church and damage outside the church. And we're told in the Bible that the non-believers will know that we are Christians by our love for one another. Maybe you could put in your book some material that would really exhort both sides to take a more charitable view towards one another. And he says, yeah, he agreed with that, but he wound up publishing the book as it was originally given to me. So since he didn't alter it in any way, I said, well, I mean, I appreciate what you're trying to do, but these are the reasons why I can't endorse the book.
Now, why I ask this question is because when I've given, and by the way, I forgot his name has passed away, but do you remember Mike in the Perth chapter, the RTB chapter in Australia? His name was Mike.
Oh yeah, he lived in Perth.
Yes.
Yeah. I'm trying to come up with the name myself.
Yeah.
Been going off a couple times.
Right. So after I met you that day at University of Western Australia, that evening talk you gave, and then I asked you, hey, is there any way I can help and join and be part of the chapter group? And you directed me to Mike. And so I have helped out the chapter. Mike has since then he's gone to America, I think, and he's doing something in
right.
Yeah. But I guess, and I don't know. I think unofficially, I'm still a quote unquote reasons to believe presence in the city, and I have a few friends with that hold on to the William Lane Craig chapter apologetics group. They run that, and I've given talks using Navigating Genesis, and I've kind of fleshed it out a little bit more. I've gone into it in other areas a little more deeply and technically. And so this past week, because I use John Sale Hammer's Expositor's Bible commentary for certain Hebrew terms here and there, especially his argument about day 4 relative to the merism of day 1, that the sun obviously wasn't created on day 4. And so when I heard of his passing, I was like, okay, that's unfortunate and that's sad. But that kind of motivated me to look at any other of his other works that I don't have. And I noticed that the Genesis Unbound book is from the 90s.
Right.
I then picked it up and I read, like, after he makes his long argument, which is a very unique argument. I've never seen him make such an argument, even in the Expositor's Bible commentary. But when I came across his official translation of the passage, it was reading just like a concordus model, just like the model that you're proposing.
Right.
When you came across that translation, because he actually says that the sun was being stopped by the clouds, and when you actually read through the translation, I'm thinking to myself, John Sale Hammer is not only acknowledging the ancient Near East, John Walton's model that you see in his writings, but this is Hugh Ross's concordus model, and so it was just this last week I knew about. I did not know that such a translation existed. So, is there a way that you can, like, if you're familiar with it, that we can endorse that translation in some sense?
Well, that's why John thought I'd be happy to endorse the book, because I said, well, that part I like, and there's a lot of parts of the book that I like, but I mean, the way he tried to integrate young Earth and old Earth, I just felt this isn't going to work. Moreover, I was concerned it was actually going to offend the young Earth creationists rather than appease them in any way. And I noticed that's what happened. Young Earth creationists don't like his book. So, but no, I like John and what he was doing. And by the way, John's not unique. When I ran into Gleason Archer in the 1990s, he told me that back in 1955, he had written a long piece on Genesis 1 and 2. And he says, Hugh, it's identical to what I've read in your works. He says, the reason I didn't publish it, I wasn't sure if the science would stand up. So I never published it, but I'm here to tell you that just from the Hebrew by itself, I came up with the identical interpretation. And he was really thrilled to discover that the science actually backed it up. So I encourage him to publish it. You know, as you know, he passed away shortly thereafter.
Right. And I think just nearing the millennium, you and him, or just after the millennium, you and him were in that Genesis debate book with Gleason and a few others. I forget now, but yeah. And what I noticed was your ministry, your Reasons to Believe ministry was it 84 that you started it?
85.
85.
Yeah.
When I saw his 1982 Encyclopedia of Bible Difficulties book, and not just that, but his survey of the Old Testament, which predate your emergence, your ministry, he gave a concordance model translation, and I was just like, yeah, Gleason Archer is also. I mean, but what's fascinating is these are people that don't have a science background, and yet just out of the in some sense the ambiguities of the Hebrew text, they're still able to draw out an accurate chronology. As you, as a scientist, go, yes, that's, and not only that, but now we're in 2018, and science has become a lot more accurate since then, and again has showcased Genesis to be true.
Right.
Yeah. Right. Okay. Another question: have you further investigated the Persian Gulf flooding since you're navigating Genesis?
Yes, there's a geologist who's done some work there, pointing out that there's actually evidence for an ancient berm at the Gulf of Hormuz. So he says this would be more evidence that the Persian Gulf was dry during the last ice age. But you know, you don't even need the berm to get it dry, because the sea levels during the last ice age were 330 feet lower, and there's very little of the Persian Gulf that's below 330 feet. And so, if there's now a consensus amongst geophysicists that during the last ice age, about 90% of today's Persian Gulf was above sea level. But this geologist was making the point that as the sea level was rising, this berm would have held a barrier to that rising sea. And if there was some kind of tectonic event that broke the berm, you'd have a massive rush of water running through the Persian Gulf and all the way up into Mesopotamia. And he feels that that high velocity rush of water with the breaking of the berm could explain the widespread destruction of Noah's flood. So he says the combination of torrential rain, the breaking of the berm, the melting of ice off of the mountains surrounding the Persian Gulf and Mesopotamia would easily explain why no humans and none of their animals survived.
Right. Would this be comparable, like in a very miniature way, to the Zanclean flood that took place 5 million years prior? The Gilbert Strait, that the Atlantic Ocean was coming in and filling the Mediterranean.
Yeah, definitely.
Would it be something like that? Like
something like that. Although he was making the point that because he says we actually see evidence for this berm at the Gulf of Hormuz. It's hard to date when that berm formed or when it broke, but he said we can easily imagine where it's just like a big dam. You break the dam, the whole thing suddenly collapses. There's a heavy weight of water behind it. It would be an instantaneous flooding that would rush out from it. And he calculated that the water would be moving at about 40 miles an hour.
So out of everything that you've written in Navigating Genesis, I got hooked on specifically this Noah's flood thing. So at university, at my digital library, I was jumping straight into the peer review journals. And let me just screenshot you a particular, I don't know if you can see this.
Right.
Now, this is from a 2015 paper that was published by the Saudi Arabian Geoscience Journal. And it is peer reviewed. It's out there. It's not
Mm.
fringe, I guess. But basically, this guy, when he wrote this, argues that yes, indeed, there was a roughly a 15-month sudden deluge, and according to computer simulations that he did, this is the extent of the water that came down when the ice on top of these mountains, and basically he dated this to 13,000 years ago. And but I suspect you might be saying that Noah and the flood would have happened earlier than that, or would you say that a 13,000-year framework works?
Yeah, 13,000 is a bit too recent in my opinion, because by that time, all that ice you see on this map would have melted away. The peak of the last ice age was about 26,000 years ago.
Oh, this would be water. Sorry, Hugh. All this is water. Yeah.
That's all water. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So
Yeah.
this was a model that I was intrigued by, because it makes sense, because yes, in the Persian Gulf, Garden of Eden would be situated around here, and well, I suspect water would be filling a lot around here. But from a crude estimate, he's saying that in this region, you have a sudden 13-month or 15-month deluge of all the water on the Hijaz Mountains here flowing down and filling this entire region. And
Right.
he's not even thinking of Noah's flood. And I found this correlation quite fascinating.
Right.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, I could easily envision that kind of flood happening. That might have been a flood later than Noah's flood. So just like they have a massive flood event in the Black Sea, that's about 7,500 years ago. So Noah's flood is not the only really big flood, but according to the Bible, it's the flood that wiped out all of humanity. So, yeah, I mean, this is interesting. I do cite an archaeological work in Navigating Genesis, where a German archaeologist found 60 villages all around the Persian Gulf, right at the shoreline. And his comment was they date to be the earliest villages that we have. Oh, there's the paper. Okay.
Yes, this just to show you the name of the paper. It's the Geomorphological Hydrogeological Evidence of a Holocene Deluge in Arabia.
Yeah.
And here's the dates. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
I would love to send you this paper if you can review it.
I'd love for you to send it to me. That'd be great.
Yep. Sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But, these 60 villages being the oldest villages we have dated, he says the only way to interpret that is that these were villages that were built in response to the rising of the sea level at the end of the last ice age. And therefore, he's not a believer.
That's Jeffrey Rose.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I looked at his paper. He released one in 2014. Because I saw you refer to a 2010 paper. He then finalized his findings in 2014, and there's even more. The four rivers in Genesis 2, Jeffrey
Right.
Rose connects that. This author here also speaks about human settlements in the Persian Gulf, referring back to Jeffrey Rose. I mean, when you search these journal articles, I put in keywords here and there and see the hits, and it's a paper that came after the publication of Navigating Genesis, but it confirms the model that you're proposing and also the papers that came prior. And this is why I got really excited, and I wanted to find out your opinion on it. Yeah.
Right. Well, bottom line is, I think the old Earth model, the traditional old Earth model that only Mesopotamia was flooded, needs to be revised. It's a bigger flood than that.
Right. Okay. I don't know. Do you want to say anything else, Dr. Ross, on that, or I don't mind. We can.
Well,
Yeah.
I've never done Google Hangout like this before, but I can tell you this is a really good medium. and I'm open to doing this again sometime if you want to organize it. So,
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. So it's great to see all of you because I've seen your name on Facebook, but now I actually get to see the person.
Yeah, and it's crazy how fast time has flown. It's been 4 years since you came to Perth, and please, Dr. Ross, come back to Perth because we're so isolated and tucked away, and yet there's a lot of nerds here. And yeah,
You're mentioning that there's a reasonable faith chapter in Perth as well.
yes.
Next year, I think it's February of next year, I'm going to be in Singapore at a reasonable faith conference. And so they've invited me to speak there.
Okay.
So that's what, 2,500 miles from you guys. So
yeah,
fact,
yeah.
I think Singapore is the closest big city to you guys.
Oh yeah. So it might be a 3 or 4 hour flight from where I am. So because I'm right tucked down in the corner.
Well, what I'm suggesting is you can organize some stuff and maybe Mike McCleary, that's the guy's name.
Mike McCleary, that's right. Yes.
He's told me if I ever get close to Perth, he'll organize stuff. So, maybe when I'm doing that trip to Singapore, we can add on a jaunt to Perth. So,
and the other person that's just to come back to memory is Paul. If you remember Paul.
I remember Paul.
Yeah.
So,
okay. Thanks so much, Dr. Ross. I will. How do I get that paper to you? Do I send it via Facebook, or do I send it in an email, or how would you like me to do it?
In an email, or maybe if it's got a URL link, that's enough. I could look it up through that. Okay. So give me the DOI. If it's got a DOI, that'll be enough.
Yep.
But if you want to email it to me, hross@reasons.org.
Okay. And I'll also probably send you, I guess you could say, my PowerPoint PDF of how I've been organizing this, this research and presenting it.
Sure.
And Kenny Rhodes, actually, being a visiting scholar, he's looked through it as well. He likes it, and yeah, I'm just wanting to help out with the team, and it's very encouraging.
Well, thank you for putting this together, and thank you for being patient with my trying to get on Google Hangout.
That's all right. Okay. Any last comments from everyone, or yeah? Does anyone else want to say anything? No.
That was great. Great talk.
Thank you so much.
Definitely hope we could do it again.
That'd be great.
Okay. All right. I'm going to end the broadcast. Thanks a lot, everyone. And I'll see you again next time in another live hangout.
All right.